The autumn house party at Vane Hall was 3 days old, and no one had looked at the maid carrying the coal scuttle down the east passage. That was the point. Cecily stood 3 feet behind Mrs. Mason. Dorothea Crane and kept her eyes on the floor as she had learned to do in the first 12 hours of wearing gray linen and a white cap. The cap was too large and sat low on her forehead. The apron smelled of starch and wood smoke. Her hands, which had never in 24 years done harder labor than needlework, and the occasional unfortunate encounter with a garden rake, had developed a blister on the right palm from the coal scuttle's handle. She did not move. She did not breathe above what was necessary. She listened. "The girl sees shadows where there are none," Mrs. Crane said to Aldous Vane. Her voice dropped to a register. "She believed no servant could hear. She has done so since childhood." Her father indulged it. "You were right to be concerned. Aldous Vane, 48 years old and florid as a man who had spent 20 years being right about everything, set down his port glass and made a sound of tired agreement. She imagines things. It is a nervous disposition. Her mother was the same." Cecily did not lift her eyes. She breathed in through her nose, a measured count of 4, and continued toward the grate. She had not imagined the stair railing that gave way in January, 3 weeks after her father's funeral. She had not imagined the particular taste of the chamomile tea in March, nor the hours she had spent afterward with her face pressed to the cold porcelain of the basin. She had imagined none of it. She had simply for 8 months lacked the evidence to say so to anyone who would listen. The door at the end of the passage opened. A man entered in a navy coat, and the quality of the air in the passage changed. Cecily felt it before she saw it. She had learned in the past 3 days that the Viscount Ashbourne, who occupied the estate adjacent to her father's, and who had accepted her uncle's autumn invitation with what she now understood was purpose, had a way of entering a room that made every other person in it recalculate their position. He did not do it through noise or through size. Though he was tall enough and broad enough to warrant notice, he did it through stillness. He was the stillest man she had ever observed in the way that deep water is still. And she had understood within an hour of seeing him that the stillness was not peace. He crossed the threshold, and his gaze moved down the passage with a deliberate, unhurried sweep, the way a man looks at a room when he is mapping it, rather than seeing it. His gaze reached Cecily. It paused. She looked at the floor. His gaze moved on to Aldous Vane and Mrs. Crane, and Cecily did not see what happened to his face, but she felt the pause against her skin like a change in weather. If you are moved by stories of women who choose to act rather than wait, stay close. What happened next in the east passage of Vane Hall changed everything that followed. She carried the coal scuttle to the grate and knelt to tend the fire. Her hands did not shake. She had not set out to be brave. She had set out to survive. Her father, Sir William Vane, had died in the last week of January, in the second winter, of a cold that the physician said had settled in his chest. He had been 53 and healthy the previous spring. The cold had come quickly, a matter of 3 weeks, from first cough to burial. And the progression had been so swift that Cecily had not entirely believed it until she stood at the graveside in the hard January frost and watched the first soil fall. The estate, under the terms of the baronetcy, passed in trust to Cecily until her marriage, at which point her husband would hold it. If she died unmarried, it reverted to the nearest male relation. Aldous Vane was the nearest male relation. He had understood this and made his condolences and arrived at the house 3 days after the funeral, with the particular settled authority of a man who had decided that certain arrangements required his immediate oversight. The physician had been her uncle's physician, recommended and paid for by Aldous, at a moment when Cecily, 24 years old and in shock, had been grateful for anything that resembled help. She had been grateful, too, when Aldous had arranged the house in Bath where she was nominally residing under the chaperonage of an elderly great-aunt. She had been grateful in the bruised, unthinking way of a person whose world has just dissolved. And she had not asked the questions that a clearer head would have asked. The stair railing had clarified things. It had given way on a Tuesday morning in January, 3 weeks after the funeral, and she had caught herself on the newel post and stood on the landing for a full minute, looking at the clean, bright fracture in the wood, thinking about the fact that she had come down those stairs every morning for a fortnight, and the railing had held. She had said nothing, because she did not yet know what she was saying nothing about. The tea in March had been more difficult to explain away. By April, she had tried to explain it to the family solicitor, a careful man named Price, who had managed her father's affairs for 30 years, and she had been in the middle of that explanation when a letter arrived from Aldous dismissing Price and installing a new solicitor of his own choosing. She had sat with the letter in her hands and understood that the walls were being moved around her while she slept. She had told Peg. Peg Norris, her lady's maid, since Cecily was 15 and Peg was 17, who had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and who had said without preamble that they should find out who was doing it before they finished. Peg had said we. Cecily had loved her for it. The swap had taken an evening to arrange. Cecily's gowns fit Peg, with minor adjustment at the waist. Peg's gray dress fit Cecily in the shoulders, and was too long in the hem, which she had resolved by taking in 2 inches at the seam. They had practiced for a week in the house and bath, with Peg coaching her on the particular way a lady's maid carried a scuttle, kept her eyes down, and moved through a room as though she were furniture. Cecily had practiced until she could do it for an hour without thinking. She had practiced the particular quality of attention that made a maid invisible, which was not actually inattentiveness at all, but its precise opposite, sharpened and turned inward, so that you gathered everything and showed nothing. She had arrived at Vane Hall, her father's house, her own house, 3 days ago as Norris, the lady's maid, in the second carriage, with the other servants. She had not cried when she walked in through the servants' entrance. She had noted the changes Aldous had made to the entry hall, counted them, and gone upstairs to tend to Peg. Peg, playing Miss Vane with a composure that suggested she had been waiting her whole life for the opportunity, had navigated the first day of the house party with a social grace that Cecily found slightly humbling. She had managed dinner conversation, deflected the nephew Aldous kept steering toward her, and conveyed, in the ways that well-bred young women conveyed things, a faint general disinclination toward the proceedings. Cecily had watched from the sideboard while she served and thought that Peg was better at being her than she was. On the second evening, the man arrived. He came after dinner when the guests were settled in the drawing-room with cards and conversation, and he was let in through the study door off the south corridor by someone who knew the house well enough to use that entrance. Cecily had been in the corridor with a candle, returning from the kitchen passage, and she had pressed herself into the door alcove and watched the study door close. She did not know the man. He was perhaps 50, gray-coated, with a document case tucked under his arm, and he moved like a man who made a living from moving quickly through other people's houses. He was inside for 30 minutes. When he emerged, he went out the same way he had entered, and the study door was latched again behind him as though nothing had passed between them. She had stayed in the alcove for 20 minutes after he left, turning over what she had seen. She had been in the east passage the following morning, carrying linens, when she heard the footstep behind her and stilled. "Norris," said a low, level voice, "the fire in the east passage needs attention." She had turned. The Viscount Ashbourne stood 6 feet behind her, alone in the passage, looking at her with an expression that was not curiosity and was not surprise and was not anything she had a word for. His gray eyes held hers for 3 counted seconds. There was a fire burning in the east passage grate. It did not need attention. "Yes, my lord," she said, and went to tend it. She understood, crouching at the grate with her back to him, that he had seen through the cap and the apron and the blister. She did not know yet whether that made him dangerous or the opposite of dangerous. She heard him pause behind her, and then she heard his footsteps move away, down the passage and around the corner, and she stayed at the grate until she was certain he was gone. She did not sleep much that second night. The kitchen passage at Vane Hall ran between the scullery and the larder, and ended in a narrow stair that went up to the servants' floor above the cook's mother, a woman of 80 years, called Mrs. Bidgen. Hensby slept in the small room at the bottom of that stair, because her lungs could not manage the climb, and because Mrs. Hensby, who had been cook at Vane Hall for 40 years before her daughter took over the post, had earned the right to sleep wherever she chose. Cecily had discovered Mrs. Mitteray, Hensby, on the first evening. When she had come down to the kitchen after midnight for a glass of water and found the old woman sitting up in the dark with a candle stub, unable to sleep, they had sat together for an hour. Cecily had read to her from a small book of Psalms she had found on the shelf above the woman's bed, because Mrs. Hensby's eyes were too weak for the light. The old woman had not asked why a lady's maid kept such easy hours, or carried herself with such particular stillness. She had only folded her hands in her lap and listened. On the third night, at 11:30, Cecily was in the passage with the book again. When she heard the door at the far end open, she went on reading. The psalm was the 23rd, and she read it slowly, the way her father had taught her to read aloud, as though the words had weight and deserved the time. She turned the page. The door had not closed. "You should be in bed, Norris." She turned. Lord Ashbourne stood in the passage doorway with his coat still on, and no candle, which meant he had come from the lit corridor. His face in the single candle flame from Mrs. Nassy. Hensby's shelf was difficult to read, as his face was always difficult to read, but she noticed that he did not look at the old woman with surprise or impatience. He looked at her the way you look at something you recognize. "So should you, my lord," Cecily said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Something that might have been the memory of one. Mrs. Hensby, who had been listening with her eyes closed, in a way that did not mean she was sleeping, said, "Let the dear girl finish the psalm, my lord. She reads beautifully." Lord Ashbourne looked at Cecily for another 3 seconds, the way he had looked at her in the East Passage. Then he stepped back into the corridor and pulled the door half closed, and Cecily heard him stop just outside it. She finished the psalm. She said good night to Mrs. Hensby, tucked the book back above the bed, and stepped into the corridor. He was leaning against the wall 6 inches from the door, his arms crossed, looking at the opposite stones. He said, without looking at her, that she should come to the still room in 10 minutes. The still room was small and smelled of dried lavender and old wood, and it was the one room in Vane Hall below stairs that had a door with a bolt. She found this practical, and noticed that he had presumably known about the bolt, which meant he had thought about it, which meant he had intended this conversation for longer than 10 minutes. She bolted the door. He did not sit. He stood with his back to the shelves of drying herbs, and looked at her across the narrow room in a way that acknowledged, without any ceremony of introduction, that they were no longer pretending she was Norris. The room smelled of dried lavender and old wood and the particular faint sweetness of herbs kept too long in a closed space. A single candle burned on the shelf behind him. It was very small and the room was very quiet, and she became aware in this quiet that she could hear his breathing, and her own, and nothing else in the world. His sister, he said, had died at Vane Hall 3 years ago. He said it in his level way, without inflection, as though the steadiness of his voice could hold the weight of the sentence and prevent it from landing on the floor between them. It did not quite succeed. She heard what the evenness cost him. His sister Eleanor had been 22 and a guest at Aldous Vane's September house party. She had been found at the bottom of the great stair in the morning. He had believed it, for 6 months, because he had wanted to believe it, because there had been nothing to contradict it, except a feeling in his chest that he could not put into words, and a man of his temperament did not act on feelings he could not put into words. He had tried for a year after that to act on evidence instead, and had found nothing that anyone would call evidence, and had learned to carry the feeling as though it were simply weight he had agreed to bear. He had been bearing it for 3 years. He had come to this house party because Colford's name had appeared in London and because the weight had shifted slightly, the way a long-held stone shifts when you finally change your grip. The man who had entered through the study door the previous evening was named Colford. He dealt in forged documents, primarily probate documents and conveyances of property. Ashbourne had encountered his name through a solicitor in London while investigating a proposed property conveyance that Aldous Vane had attempted to arrange 3 years ago, shortly after Eleanor's death. The conveyance would have benefited Aldous directly upon the transfer of certain funds Eleanor had held. It had never been completed, because Eleanor had died before the necessary document was produced, and Aldous had declined to proceed without it. That detail had struck the London solicitor as odd. It had struck Ashbourne as something considerably darker. He stopped. He looked at her. The candlelight was doing something particular to the angles of his face, and she saw that he looked, in this moment, less like the composed man she had watched in the dining room, and more like someone who had been holding a thing at arm's length for 3 years and was deciding slowly to set it down. She put her hand in the apron pocket and took out the pressed violet. She had carried it since January in whatever she was wearing. It had lived in her father's Bible on the page of the 23rd Psalm, pressed there decades ago by her mother. And she had taken it out the morning of the funeral and kept it on her person, because the house did not feel safe, and the violet did. She held it out on her palm. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "He killed my father," she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud. To another person, he looked at her. Not the violet. Not yet proven. Not yet. He nodded. Once. The small, precise nod of a man deciding something. He said that Colford would return before the end of the party, because Aldous needed the document before Christmas, when the inheritance question would become more complicated. He had come to this party because he intended to find the document. He had not anticipated a Confederate. She closed her fingers over the violet and put it back in her pocket. "I am not your Confederate, my lord. I am the woman whose life is contingent on finding it first." He looked at her for a long moment with that deliberate gray gaze, and she held it steadily and did not look away, and something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly, like the surface of deep water when a stone touches it, and the ripple is too slight to see until you are watching for it. "Then we have parallel interests," he said. The next morning, Aldous Vane made an occasion of his concern. He did it at dinner, which was 12 covers, and he did it with the smooth, practiced fluency of a man who had been managing the perceptions of other people for 20 years. He had been speaking with Lord Ashbourne about the upcoming season, and he had turned the conversation with a sigh that contrived to be both tender and exhausted, and he had said that he worried about his niece. She had a nervous disposition, he said, quite inherited, and she tended to imagine difficulties where none existed. He had tried to be a conscientious guardian, but a young woman of her particular temperament required a great deal of reassurance. Peg, seated at the table as Miss Vane in the cream gown with the green ribbon, had lowered her eyes at this precise moment, in a way that Cecily, watching from the sideboard, recognized as Peg preventing herself from saying something that would have resolved several difficulties immediately. Lord Ashbourne had said nothing. He had cut his meat with the precision of a man who was thinking about something else entirely. The muscle in his jaw moved once and stopped. Later that afternoon, Cecily found herself in the south corridor, where she had no particular errand, watching the light come in at the far window and thinking. The footman who came through on his way to the dining room paused, and she asked him something casual about the house arrangements, and in the course of his answer he mentioned, in the offhand way of someone repeating something often said, that Mr. Vane had been explaining Miss Vane's difficulties to the assembled company again, the way he did. He shook his head in a manner that was more resigned than unkind. The girl imagined things. Mr. Vane said it was a family affliction. Cecily thanked him, and went on looking at the window. That evening she received a folded note slipped under the door of the room she shared with 2 other maids, addressed simply to N, in a hand that was spare and angular and entirely legible. It said that Colford was a document dealer with an address in London. He did not yet have the document Aldous needed. Ashbourne believed the document was in the house. She lay awake for the better part of 2 hours going through her father's house in her memory, room by room, placing Colford in it, placing Aldous with him, thinking about what document an uncle needed to produce before Christmas to resolve an inheritance question he had believed was already resolved. She thought about her father's will. She thought about the new solicitor. She thought about the 6 weeks between her father's death and her uncle's dismissal of old Price, and what might have happened to a document that had been in Price's keeping and was then no longer. She sat up at 2 in the morning with the pressed violet in her hand and understood what she needed. The codicil. Her father had mentioned, once in the autumn before he died, that he had added something to the will. He had not explained it. She had not pressed him. She had assumed, with the comfortable inattention of someone who believes she has time, that she would learn its contents when they became relevant. And the codicil had never appeared in any document Aldous had shown her. On the 4th afternoon of the house party, while the gentlemen were at billiards and the ladies occupied in the drawing room, Cecily slipped into her father's study with a candle and a pair of ungloved hands and searched for 2 hours. The room had the particular quality of a space that had been carefully tidied by someone who was not its owner. Her father's desk had always been a landscape of organized accumulation, books and letters and small objects placed with the logic of a mind that remembered everything. Aldous had apparently had it cleared. The surface was bare and polished. The drawers had been sorted in a manner that suggested thoroughness without familiarity. She did not find the codicil. She found something else. In the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath a stack of estate maps, lay a letter in her uncle's hand, addressed to Colford and dated 3 days before the current house party had begun. She read it twice, with the particular careful attention she had learned from reading aloud to Mrs. Hensby, giving each line its full weight. She folded it back exactly as it had been folded and replaced it beneath the maps. She went upstairs. She found Peg alone in the dressing room for the evening's change and said, quietly, that tonight Peg should be careful about anything she was given to drink. Peg looked at her over the hairbrush. "Do not drink it," Cecily said. She positioned herself that evening in the connecting passage that ran behind the guest wing, where she could see through the cracked door into the corridor outside Miss Vane's room. She had the candle out and leaned against the cold plaster and waited, and she had been there for 40 minutes when Mrs. Crane came down the corridor with a small cup of posset. She watched Mrs. Crane knock. She watched Peg open the door, accept the cup with the particular gracious murmur that meant Peg had understood, and close the door. She counted to 30, and then she knocked twice. And Peg opened the door and handed her the cup untouched. Cecily held it. The posset smelled of honey and warm milk, and something beneath those things that she could not name, but that her body recognized by memory from a morning in March when she had pressed her face to cold porcelain. She set the cup on the hall table and stood looking at it for a long moment. She had known in the architecture of her mind that this was what she was here to find. She had known it the way you know. Things you cannot afford to believe until you have proof. The cup was proof. Someone had prepared it for whoever was sleeping in that room. Someone had meant for that woman not to wake. They had meant to kill her, not to manage her or inconvenience her or arrange her into a marriage or a quiet dependency. To kill her as they had killed her father, and leave it for the physician to call natural. She sat down on the floor of the corridor, with her back to the wall, and her knees drawn up and the pressed violet in her hand. And she stayed there for a long time. The corridor was cold. The plaster at her back held the chill of a house that had lost its fires for the night, and the air tasted of old wood and the faint remainder of candle smoke, and somewhere below her a clock ticked through the quarter hours with indifferent patience. She thought about her father. She thought about him specifically, the way you think about a person, rather than the idea of them, which meant she thought about the smell of his study, and the particular angle of his handwriting, and the way he had always called her by her full name when he was serious, and by nothing at all when he was content. Just to look across the supper table that contained everything he intended to say. She thought about November, the last November, when he had been healthy, and she had sat with him in the evening while he read, and she had been bored by it, mildly and peacefully bored, the way you are bored when nothing is threatening you. Which she now understood had been the most valuable feeling she had ever possessed. The violet was in her palm. The cup was on the table. She did not let herself grieve yet. She noted, carefully and without sentiment, that she would need to do it later, and that later was not now. She intended to be herself again. She wrote a note before she went to sleep, and sent it by the stable boy at first light, addressed to Mr. Silas Price at his offices in the market town 12 miles off. It was a short note. She said she required him at Vane Hall, that she believed there was a document that needed verifying, and asked him to come that morning if he was able. She did not know if he would come. He was a careful man who had managed her father's affairs for 30 years and had been summarily dismissed by Aldous Vane, and a careful man who has been dismissed once may or may not choose to risk a second confrontation. She had done what she could. Peg helped her into her own gown at 7 o'clock in silence, the cream with the green ribbon, and pinned her hair with the practiced efficiency of 5 years of morning routines. The gown felt strange after 4 days of gray linen. It felt strange in the way of a thing reclaimed. The familiar weight of her own life returned to her shoulders. Her reflection in the small glass above the washstand was a person she recognized and had almost forgotten she was allowed to be. When Peg reached for the white cap, Cecily said no. "Peg, put the cap down." She looked at Cecily in the glass with an expression that was composed and warm, and said everything between them without requiring words. Then she smoothed the pin at the back of Cecily's hair, one small, firm pressure of her fingers, and stepped back. Cecily picked up the cup of posset from the table where she had carried it upstairs and held it in both hands, and she went down to breakfast. The dining room at 9 o'clock held 11 of the house party's 12 guests, the 12th being an elderly colonel who did not rise before 10. Aldous sat at the head of the table in his habitual posture of comfortable authority, and Mrs. Crane was to his left, and Lord Ashbourne was seated at the far end in a position she suspected he had arranged for himself with intent, because it gave him a clear view of the door. He saw her the moment she entered. His face did not change. He put down his cup. Cecily walked to the sideboard and set the posset cup on it. Then she turned to face the table. "I am Cecily Vane," she said. "I apologize to those of you who were not aware that you have been speaking with my lady's maid this week. I have been in this house in her place, because I had reason to believe my life was in danger, and I needed to understand from whom." The silence was the kind that has weight. Aldous Vane set down his fork. "My dear girl," he began, in the register of tired, tender management she had heard from 3 feet away in the East Passage, and she said quietly, "that he should not." She said it the way her father had said difficult things without heat. "There is a cup on the sideboard," she continued. "Mrs. Crane brought it last night to the room where she believed Miss Vane was sleeping. I believe it contains something that would have made the occupant of that room very ill. It made me ill in March. The first time it was administered, I did not understand what I had been given at the time." She looked at Aldous. "There is also a letter in the bottom drawer of my father's desk, beneath the estate maps, in your hand, addressed to a man named Colford. I read it yesterday afternoon. I did not take it, because I wished you to know that I had left it exactly as I found it, and that other people are aware of its contents." Mrs. Crane made a sound. It was a small sound, and it was the sound of something held very carefully for a long time beginning to give way. "She imagines things," Aldous said to the table, and Cecily recognized the exhausted patience in his voice as the voice she had heard in the East Passage 3 days ago. And she waited, and she let the room breathe. Lord Ashbourne pushed back his chair. He did not cross the room quickly. He walked with the same unhurried, deliberate pace that he used in every room, as though nothing could make him move faster than he chose to move, and he came to stand beside the sideboard, beside Cecily, and he turned to face the table. The room had gone utterly still. Even the fire had quieted. "Miss Vane named it," he said into that stillness. "She is correct, and you will answer for it." 12 words level as stone, the kind of sentence that closes rooms. From the doorway came the measured tread that Cecily knew before she turned. Mr. Silas Price, in his good gray coat and his reliable expression, with a document case under his arm. He had come from the village that morning. He had brought with him a copy of the codicil he had made in his own records before the original was removed from his keeping because... Mr. Fowler. Price was a careful man of 30 years' experience, and he had sensed something wrong in the weeks after Sir William's death, and had had the foresight to make a copy before he was dismissed. The codicil named a trustee for the estate in the event of Cecily's death before marriage. It was not Aldous Vane. It was Silas Price himself, with Ashbourne named as witness and adviser. It had been signed and dated in November, 2 months before Sir William died. Her father had known. He had suspected, and he had arranged what arrangements he could, and he had not told her, because she had been 23, and he had believed he had more time. She stood in the dining room of her father's house, and held that understanding, and let it settle, because there was nothing else to do with it, and because she had come here to act, and she had acted, and the rest would have to be grieved later, in some quieter place. Aldous looked at the copy of the codicil with the expression of a man watching a door he believed was locked. Swing open from the inside, Mrs. Crane did not look at it. Mrs. Crane was looking at her hands, and her hands were still. The matter was conveyed to the magistrate by the afternoon. Mr. Price supervised the estate's records pending a legal proceeding. The cup went with the magistrate's man, who had a colleague in London familiar with such substances and the particular ways they could make a robust cough settle fatally in a chest over the course of a winter. Colford's name was submitted through the same channels. Cecily spent the afternoon in the housekeeper's sitting room with Peg, who was making tea, in the particular methodical way she made tea when she was managing strong feeling. They did not speak much. When Peg set down the cup in front of her, Cecily put her hand over Peg's hand and held it. And Peg pressed back, and that was sufficient. The house party departed the following morning, in carriages and post-chaises, and with the subdued haste of people who had witnessed something they would be processing for the remainder of the season. Aldous left under a different kind of supervision. A fortnight later, Cecily was in Ashbourne's library. She was there at the invitation of his great-aunt, Lady Marian Hartley, 71 years old, and cheerfully clear-eyed, who had decided that Cecily ought to have a fire and a decent library and a few weeks in which the question of what came next did not need to be answered urgently. Lady Marian sat in the corner chair by the window with her embroidery and fell asleep over it at approximately 3 in the afternoon, and stayed that way with gratifying consistency. Peg was in the next room. The proprieties were observed with the minimum ceremony necessary. Edmund Hartley, Viscount Ashbourne, sat across from Cecily in the other chair by the fire and read, as he did most evenings, with the absorbed quiet of a man who had long since made peace with his own company. He had been reading the same page for 20 minutes. She had been watching him do it. She had depressed Violet in her left hand lying open in her palm, the way she sometimes held it when she was thinking about her father. The deep purple blue had faded at the edges to something closer to gray, and the paper it was pressed to was soft with age, and she had been looking at it rather than at her own book for the better part of an hour. "You carry it always," he said. He had not looked up from his page. "Since January," she said. He put the book down on the arm of the chair and looked at the violet in her open hand with the expression he had used in the still room, the one she had since learned to translate. It was not calculation, and it was not coldness. It was the quality of attention of a man who had spent 3 years looking at things directly, because he could not afford to look away. He reached across the space between the chairs and took the violet from her palm. He held it in both his hands for a moment, looking at it, and then he did not give it back. He held his hands together with the violet pressed between his palms, and he set his closed hands over hers, and she felt the slight weight of them, and the warmth and the faint rasp of his thumb across her knuckle. "Eleanor pressed flowers," he said. He said it in the same level voice he used for everything, but she heard what was beneath the level. She had been learning, for a fortnight, to hear beneath the level. She turned her hand over slowly, so that her palm was up, and she closed her fingers gently around his hands where they rested over hers. He looked at her. She looked at him. The fire in the grate made its small shifting sound, and from the corner, Lady Marian breathed in the composed rhythm of comfortable sleep. "Cecily," he said, her name, her given name for the first time. He said it the way he did most things of weight, quietly, without performance, as though the word itself were sufficient and did not need decoration. She held his hands. He let her. If this story found you when you needed it, leave a word in the comments. There are more. Outside the library window, the first serious snow of November was coming down in long, slow diagonals across the gray stone of the estate's south face, and the light through the glass was the particular white-blue of late afternoon in England when the world has gone soft and still. A candle burned on the table beside her. Another burned on the table beside him. Between the two small flames, in the warmth that held them, nothing in the room moved, except the fire and the snow, and somewhere in the vicinity of her chest, something that had been braced against a blow for the better part of a year and was for the first time deciding it could rest. She did not let go of his hands. The violet was still between his palms where he had placed it when he took it from her, and she thought of her father pressing it there decades ago with her mother's hands, for reasons no one had ever explained, because some things did not need explanation. Some things were simply carried forward from one pair of hands to the next because what they meant did not diminish with time. The snow came down. The candles burned. Lady Marian slept peacefully in her corner, and outside the house the world was white and cold and thoroughly indifferent to the small, complete warmth inside it. Cecily looked at Edmund Hartley's hands over hers, and was for the first time in nearly a year entirely where she intended to be.